Picture the biting, relentless winds howling across the barren, frozen steppes of the Eurasian continent. We are looking at environmental temperatures plummeting to a staggering -40 degrees. At this extreme thermal threshold, the rules of nature are entirely unforgiving. Any unprotected human flesh exposed to this sub-zero air would suffer irreversible tissue damage, with severe frostbite setting in within a mere 10 minutes. Despite this brutal reality, our ancestors, a species of primate that originally evolved under the scorching, vibrant sun of the tropics, equipped with nothing but fragile, hairless skin, found themselves staring down the ultimate survival test. They were facing the absolute apex of the Ice Age. For decades, researchers in the fields of archaeology and paleontology have grappled with a profound biological paradox. How exactly did an organism completely lacking the thick, insulating blubber of a seal and completely devoid of the dense, warming undercoat of a woolly mammoth manage to survive those endlessly dark, freezing winters? It turns out their ultimate survival mechanism was not the invention of a sharper spear, nor was it simply huddling around a roaring campfire deep inside a cave. The true key to our lineage surviving the deep freeze was hidden inside one of the most remarkable evolutionary workarounds in human history. It was a tiny, unassuming object, roughly the size of a human fingernail, featuring a microscopic puncture that measured barely 1 millimeter across. Today, we are going to open up the paleontological archives and objectively examine the incredible, almost obsessive survival engineering of prehistoric humanity. There is a rather naive popular misconception that to fight off the freezing cold prehistoric humans simply skinned whatever megafauna they hunted, threw the raw pelts over their shoulders, and walked out into the snow. However, the academic flaw in this assumption becomes glaringly obvious the moment we apply the basic principles of thermodynamics. When raw animal hides are draped loosely over the human frame, freezing microcurrents of wind can easily slip through the wide gaping openings around the neck, the arms, and the legs. Every single time a gust of wind moves across the bare skin beneath that hide, it acts like an invisible force, rapidly stripping away the body core temperature through convection. To actually survive, rather than just succumb to the cold, our ancestors had to engineer what physicists call a stationary air layer, or a dead air space. This is a completely immobilized pocket of air trapped securely between the surface of the human epidermis and the interior lining of the garment. This trapped, unmoving layer of air is, scientifically speaking, the most efficient thermal insulator available in nature. But here is the catch. In order to successfully trap that air, the animal hide had to sit tightly against the body. It had to wrap securely around the limbs, completely seal off any gaps from the wind, and crucially, it could not shift, open, or fall apart every time a joint moved or a muscle flexed. In a primitive era long before the conceptualization of zippers, synthetic elastic bands, or chemical adhesives, human beings were pushed into an incredibly narrow evolutionary bottleneck. They had only one viable path forward. They had to figure out a way to stitch separate, tailored pieces of animal hide together using a tool. The most monumental revolution in the history of apparel engineering did not begin in a modern textile factory. According to archaeological records, it originated in the damp, freezing shadows of Denisova Cave in the Siberian Altai Mountains, dating back at least 40,000 years. In this unforgiving landscape, researchers excavated a tiny, fragile fragment of bone that carried a design feature that permanently altered the trajectory of human evolution. A minuscule hole had been carefully drilled straight through one end of the bone. The diameter of this hole was just about 1 millimeter, which is barely enough cramped physical space to pass 10 strands of human hair through. That tiny opening marked the birth of the very first eyed sewing needle in human history. Modern experimental archaeologists have actually reconstructed this manufacturing process, and the level of calculated patience it demanded is truly staggering. First, these prehistoric artisans had to carefully splinter off a thin, delicate shard of bone or antler, usually from the leg of a massive reindeer. Next, they would rub it aggressively against rough sandstone, painstakingly grinding and polishing it for hours on end to achieve a razor-sharp, piercing tip. But the most grueling challenge of all was engineering the eye of the needle itself. They had to take a sharp piece of flint, essentially a microscopic stone borer, press its tip firmly against the fragile bone, and execute a continuous, repetitive twisting motion thousands upon thousands of times. The biomechanics of it functioned exactly like a primitive hand drill. Completing just one single functional bone needle could easily consume days of exhausting, mind-numbing labor. But that tiny 1 millimeter hole would become the gateway for threads, and those threads would transform loose animal hides into an impenetrable shield, locking in the pulse of human life. However, having a needle without any thread renders the entire technological leap completely useless. In the middle of a barren Ice Age tundra, where most pliable plant life was buried under feet of solid ice and snow, where on Earth did early humans source strong, flexible thread? The archaeological evidence points to a solution deeply rooted in the primal mechanics of the food chain. The primary sewing material was harvested directly from the anatomy of the fallen prey. Our ancestors performed incredibly precise extractions, slicing along the spines of hunted deer and reindeer to extract the core spinal tendons, commonly known as sinew. When fresh, this tendon tissue is highly elastic and incredibly slippery. The hunters would bring these tissues back to the camp and expose them to the freezing, dry air for days until the tendon shrank and hardened into something resembling a rigid piece of wood. Once hardened, they would place the dried sinew on a flat stone and repeatedly strike it with a heavy cobble. This blunt force physically shattered the connective tissue matrix, causing the tendon to splinter into thousands of incredibly tough individual fiber bundles. Each of these fiber strands was only slightly thicker than a human hair. By tightly twisting and braiding these biological fibers together, they manufactured an incredibly resilient, flexible thread. But the most awe-inspiring aspect of this sinew thread lies in its molecular biochemistry. The primary component of animal tendon is a well-known structural protein called collagen. Through the lens of biochemistry, collagen exhibits a highly hygroscopic nature, meaning it aggressively absorbs moisture. Whenever snow fell onto the leather garments, melted from the body heat, and seeped into the surface, those tiny sinew threads sitting tight inside the needle holes would immediately absorb the water. As they reacted to the moisture, the collagen proteins would physically expand, swelling to a volume significantly larger than their dry state. This physical expansion generated an immense outward pressure, tightly sealing and plugging every microscopic gap within the puncture hole. Thousands of stitched seams would swell simultaneously, creating a perfectly engineered, semi-waterproof biological locking system. The freezing water was repelled, and the rapid onset of hypothermia was kept at bay. Because of this, producing enough thread for a single winter coat required the spinal tendons of numerous animals. The physical weight of a tiny bundle of sinew thread was, quite literally, the weight of human survival in the dead of the winter night. But consider the brutal reality of Ice Age leather. Unlike soft modern fabrics, these manually scraped animal hides were monstrously thick. Pushing a fragile bone needle straight through that dense barrier would shatter the tool instantly. Archaeologists theorize a meticulous, two-step process. First, our ancestors wielded a sharp stone borer to gouge an initial puncture. Then, they forcefully drove a smooth bone awl into that jagged hole, stretching the leather fibers apart without tearing them. Only then could the delicate-eyed needle, trailing its life-saving sinew, glide through. The structural integrity of the seam meant the difference between life and hypothermic death. If water seeped through the needle holes, the thermal dead air space would collapse. Wet clothing drains body heat 20 times faster than dry air. A chillingly brilliant solution was the overcast stitch. By tightly wrapping the sinew around the raw edges of overlapping hides, they forced melting snow to travel a tortuous, labyrinth-like path before reaching the skin. This was advanced, calculated waterproofing, executed in the absolute wilderness. Then came the masterpiece of anatomical engineering, three-dimensional tailoring. A flat cape creates deadly thermal gaps the moment a hunter raises his arm. To survive, our ancestors dissected the geometry of their own bodies. They cut hides into complex, interlocking shapes, fitted sleeves, leg cylinders, and intricate patchwork panels, allowing knees and elbows to flex freely without breaking that thermal seal. They were constructing wearable, articulated shelters. We don't possess these 40,000-year-old garments. Organic matter rots. But microscopic wear patterns polished into surviving bone needles, the rhythmic spacing of pierced animal teeth in ancient burials, and modern thermal simulation models all point to the same truth. Without these tailored suits, humanity would have been trapped. Instead, equipped with these second skins, humans walk straight into the nightmare of Beringia, a massive, frozen, treeless land bridge across the Arctic abyss, and colonized a new world. A microscopic hole, no wider than a grain of sand, didn't just stitch hides together. It stitched the survival and the very expansion of the human race. If you want to keep exploring the brutal, awe-inspiring truths hidden deep within the fossil record, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. Your support helps us unearth these vanished lives.